In the heart of a bustling city, the courtroom was alive with whispers. The air thick with tension, the people gathered here, unsure of what would unfold. Today was unlike any other. It wasn't just another case. No, today was going to shake the very foundations of justice. There she stood, a young black woman named Imani Davis, her hands trembling slightly, her head held high despite the weight of the world pressing down on her. Imani had never imagined that this day, the day she walked into the courthouse, would be the day her life would change forever. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't someone who deserved to be in the hot seat of a courtroom, facing charges that had been thrust upon her without reason, without cause. Yet, here she was, accused of a crime she did not commit. The charges against her were severe: assault, theft, resisting arrest. All of them were false. They had been fabricated, concocted in a story that was far from the truth. But none of that mattered in the eyes of the law when you didn't have the right representation. The legal system, as many knew all too well, often overlooked the voices of the vulnerable. And in a world where racial profiling was still prevalent, an African-American woman like Imani found herself a prime target for such injustice. It had all begun a week earlier, on a quiet afternoon in a local store. Imani had been shopping, minding her own business, when a simple misunderstanding escalated beyond reason. A store clerk, perhaps under pressure, accused her of shoplifting, even though Imani hadn't taken a single item. The clerk, unfamiliar with the truth, had immediately called the police, stating that Imani had stolen merchandise. The moment the police arrived, the situation turned into a nightmare. Despite Imani's protests and the absence of evidence, the officers, already predisposed to suspect her, took matters into their own hands. They didn't listen to her side of the story, didn't look for the truth. Instead, they arrested her on the spot, handcuffing her in front of a crowd, as if her innocence didn't matter. The shock of being arrested, the humiliation, the injustice, it all hit Imani like a wave crashing against a rocky shore. But there was more to come. As the days passed and her case made its way through the legal system, Imani found herself in the fight of her life. The charges stacked against her seemed insurmountable. Every effort to clear her name felt like it was met with resistance, and the reality of the situation was becoming more and more overwhelming. But Imani wasn't someone who would easily back down. She knew the stakes were high, and she had the heart of a warrior. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for her dignity, for her voice to be heard in a world that had often silenced people like her. As the trial date drew near, the prosecution was firm in their stance, painting Imani as a criminal. Her defense lawyer, a woman named Olivia Thomas, had prepared for the worst. Olivia was a seasoned attorney, known for her calm demeanor in the face of adversity. But even she felt the weight of the situation. The case seemed straightforward: false accusations, an unjust arrest. The only problem was that the evidence, or rather, the lack of it, seemed to be working against them. Olivia had tried to get the store's security footage to clear Imani's name, but the footage was conveniently unavailable. She had requested interviews with the witnesses, but they had mysteriously disappeared or changed their stories. Every avenue seemed to lead to a dead end. It was as if the whole system was working against them. But Olivia wasn't one to give up easily. She had seen this type of case before, cases where the system tried to crush the truth, cases where people, especially black individuals, were unjustly targeted. She knew this was bigger than just Imani's case. This was about standing up for what was right. It was about making sure that no one, no matter their race, would be falsely accused and left without a voice. The day of the trial arrived with a chilling calm. Imani sat in the defendant's chair, trying to steady her breath, trying to calm the storm in her chest. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp suit and a colder demeanor, presented his case. It was rehearsed, mechanical, a series of accusations aimed at breaking down the woman who sat before him. His words were like daggers, cutting through the air with every claim of guilt. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the prosecutor's voice. It seemed as if the entire room was waiting for a verdict, waiting for the moment when they would declare Imani guilty. And yet, in the midst of the tension, something incredible was about to happen. Imani glanced at her lawyer, Olivia, whose face remained calm, even serene. It was as if she knew something that no one else did. Olivia wasn't just another lawyer. She was someone who had dedicated her life to ensuring justice for those who had been wronged. And today, she had a plan, a brilliant one, that would turn the tide of this entire case. As the prosecutor finished his arguments, the judge called for a brief recess. The air was thick with uncertainty. People filed out of the courtroom, and the chatter started, some speaking in hushed tones, others in louder, more nervous voices. Everyone was waiting for the next move. But then, the doors opened, and Olivia stood up. She turned to Imani with a small smile. "Get ready," she whispered, her voice low but full of purpose. And just like that, Olivia walked into the courtroom, ready to stun the judge, the prosecutor, and everyone present. What happened next would leave the entire court in shock. The truth was about to be revealed. But how? The clock was ticking. The final chapter was about to unfold. As the recess came to an end, the tension in the courtroom could almost be felt in the air. The judge, sitting at the front of the room, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the clock before looking at the attorneys. The prosecutor, who had just finished presenting his case, was sitting with a confident smirk, believing that victory was within his grasp. But Olivia, standing at her table, didn't seem fazed at all. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Imani sat still, trying to steady her breathing, but there was something in Olivia's demeanor that told her everything would be okay. In that brief moment of silence, Olivia locked eyes with her client and nodded slightly. The unspoken message was clear. "Trust me." The judge banged his gavel, signaling the resumption of the trial. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned toward Olivia. It was her time to speak, to present the defense. She rose to her feet, her posture confident but calm. There was no nervousness, no hesitation. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she was ready to put the prosecutor's narrative to rest once and for all. "Your Honor," Olivia began, her voice carrying through the room with a calm authority that immediately commanded attention. "We have heard the accusations against my client. We've heard the details of a crime that was supposedly committed. But there is something you haven't heard yet. Something that, if brought to light, will change everything." A murmur rippled through the room as the eyes of the judge, the prosecutor, and the entire courtroom turned to her, hanging on her every word. Olivia wasn't just going to defend her client. She was going to expose the truth. "I would like to introduce new evidence," Olivia said, her tone unwavering. "Evidence that has been conveniently overlooked by the prosecution. This evidence is a key piece in proving that my client, Ms. Davis, is innocent of all charges." The prosecutor's face changed instantly from smug confidence to uncertainty. He shot a glance at Olivia, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We have seen every piece of evidence, every witness statement. What new evidence could you possibly have?" Olivia's response was calm, almost as if she had been expecting the question. She turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, if I may, I request that the courtroom be cleared for a moment while we present the evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. But after a brief pause, he agreed. The bailiff signaled for the courtroom to empty, and soon, only Olivia, the judge, Imani, the prosecutor, and a few essential court staff remained. A palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air. Moments later, Olivia returned with a sleek, black briefcase. She set it on the table and turned to the prosecutor, who was visibly unsettled now. She could see the flicker of doubt crossing his face. He was beginning to realize that Olivia wasn't going to let this case slip away as easily as he thought. "I have in this case the original security footage from the store where the alleged crime took place," Olivia said, her words carrying with them an air of finality. "And it is crystal clear." The prosecutor looked at her incredulously. "What are you talking about?" "The footage from that store was destroyed. It doesn't exist." Olivia gave him a small smile, one that spoke volumes about her belief in justice. "That's what you thought, but you were misinformed." She opened the briefcase, revealing a laptop inside. What I have here is the unedited footage, the full recording of the moment when Ms. Davis was allegedly caught in the act of stealing. She powered on the laptop, and a few seconds later, the footage filled the screen. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking what it showed. Imani Davis walking down the aisles of the store, browsing through the shelves with no sign of any stolen items in her hands. The courtroom staff, the prosecutor, and the judge leaned in closer. They watched intently as the footage continued to play. There was no confrontation with the store clerk, no violent behavior, no indication of theft. Imani was simply shopping, minding her own business. Olivia clicked a button, pausing the video. "Your Honor, this footage was erased from the records by the store management shortly after the incident. But we have traced it back to a secure backup system, where it was stored for emergency purposes." This footage directly contradicts every statement made by the prosecution. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He stood there, visibly struggling to process the new information, but Olivia didn't wait for him to recover. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is the truth that was hidden. This footage proves that my client is innocent of the charges leveled against her. There was no theft, no assault, and certainly no resistance to arrest. The arrest was based on false accusations alone, and it was unjust from the very start." The judge's expression hardened as he absorbed the full weight of Olivia's argument. The prosecutor, who had previously been so sure of his case, was now visibly rattled. His attempt to frame Imani as a criminal had just been shattered by the very evidence he had tried to suppress. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie silence. The stunned faces of everyone in the room said it all. No one had seen this coming. Imani's heart raced as she realized that her lawyer had just turned the entire case on its head. Olivia had managed to secure a breakthrough that was nothing short of miraculous. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at the evidence on the table. "I must admit, this is unexpected," he said, his voice soft yet filled with authority. "We will take a brief recess to evaluate the new evidence presented here." As the judge rose to leave the courtroom, the prosecutor stood frozen, his mind racing. He had underestimated Olivia Thomas, and now he was paying the price for it. Olivia returned to Imani's side, her face calm and composed, but there was a twinkle in her eye. She had done it. She had just shifted the tide of the trial in a single moment. Imani looked up at her, barely able to contain the overwhelming relief that rushed through her. She couldn't help but whisper, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Olivia smiled and patted her hand gently. "This isn't over yet, but we've taken the first step." As the courtroom emptied for the brief recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The once certain conviction was now up in the air, and all eyes were on Olivia, who had just proven that justice, though often delayed, was still within reach. The brief recess felt like an eternity. Olivia, standing at the table with her arms folded, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity. Imani sat beside her, her eyes nervously shifting from the judge's bench to Olivia's calm demeanor. Outside, the buzz of whispers could be heard from the few staff members still in the hallway. But inside the courtroom, there was an unmistakable shift in energy, a collective breath being held, waiting for the judge's decision. Olivia knew that this was a crucial moment. The truth had been revealed, and now the question was how the judge would respond. Would he uphold the evidence, or would the powers that be attempt to sweep it under the rug? She wasn't about to let that happen, not on her watch. The judge re-entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent once again. He took his seat, glanced at the evidence on the table, and then looked up at the prosecutor, whose face had paled since the moment the footage was presented. The prosecution had been prepared for one outcome: conviction. Now, that certainty had been shattered. There was no hiding the truth now. With a deep breath, the judge began to speak. "The evidence presented by the defense has been thoroughly reviewed. It is clear that the original footage, which was disregarded by the prosecution, shows that the defendant, Ms. Davis, is innocent of the charges brought against her." A gasp escaped from the prosecutor's lips, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might protest. But then, realizing that any objections would only further expose his case's weakness, he remained silent. The judge continued, The court has taken into account the circumstances surrounding the suppression of this footage and the unfair treatment that Ms. Davis received. We will now proceed with dismissing all charges against the defendant. Imani's heart skipped a beat. Dismissed? Her mind couldn't process it. Was it really happening? For so long, she had been living in fear, waiting for the moment when the weight of this false accusation would crush her. And now, in an instant, her life was about to change. As the judge made his ruling official, Olivia stood and turned toward her client. There was a brief pause before Imani's trembling hand reached out to grab Olivia's. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally began to spill over. Olivia smiled softly and gave her a reassuring squeeze. You don't need to say anything. You've been through enough. Now you're free. The weight of those words settled over Imani like a blanket. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the end of a nightmare that had haunted her every step. But the prosecutor wasn't the only one caught off guard. The entire courtroom seemed stunned by the turn of events. The clerks, who had been taking notes throughout the trial, exchanged glances with one another. The bailiff, who had remained stoic throughout the case, looked visibly shaken by the sudden reversal of fortune. The defense attorney, who had entered the courtroom with a quiet confidence, had now completely stunned the entire legal team. As Olivia and Imani made their way toward the exit, the prosecutor approached them with a tense expression. His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by something more akin to frustration and regret. He was no longer the victorious attorney he had once believed himself to be. I don't understand how this happened, he stammered, as though struggling to make sense of the reality he was facing. This footage was destroyed. How could it have resurfaced? Olivia turned to him, her expression still composed, but now tinged with an undeniable edge. It wasn't destroyed. It was hidden. You and your team failed to disclose it, intentionally or not, but the truth came to light. And now, my client's name is cleared. No amount of manipulation can change that. The prosecutor looked down, his pride having taken a severe hit. But Olivia didn't linger on the moment. She had a client to comfort and a victory to savor, even if only for a brief moment. When they stepped outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt like a warm embrace. The weight of the building had been replaced by the open sky above them. Olivia and Imani paused on the steps, both taking in the fresh air. Imani looked at Olivia, her eyes filled with gratitude. You saved me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how you did it, but you saved me. Olivia smiled, looking at her with kindness. I just did my job, but I'd like to think that it was the truth that saved you. The two women stood together in that moment. An unspoken bond formed between them, a bond forged in the fires of injustice and upheld by the power of truth. Imani had walked into that courtroom believing her life was over. But now, she was walking out with her future ahead of her, free from the shackles of a crime she never committed. As they made their way down the steps, Olivia couldn't help but think of the journey ahead, not just for Imani, but for herself as well. This case had tested her resolve, but it had also proven something crucial. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how much people try to suppress it. Olivia had just witnessed the power of justice, its ability to transcend corruption, to rise above falsehoods, and to shine through even in the darkest of times. And as she walked side by side with her client, she felt a sense of pride, knowing that she had played a role in delivering that truth. But even as they walked away, the courtroom scene still echoed in her mind. It was a reminder of just how fragile the system could be, how easily one could be caught in the web of false accusations, and how difficult it could be to undo the damage. Yet, as Olivia glanced over at Imani, she knew that today was proof that justice would always prevail. The next few days following the trial were a blur for Imani. The adrenaline of the courtroom had worn off, replaced by a quiet stillness that lingered in her apartment. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to look over her shoulder, waiting for the inevitable blow that would follow the verdict. But even as she savored this new peace, something else was stirring inside her, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, of relief and lingering anger. She had been cleared of the charges. Her name had been restored, but there were still scars, emotional wounds that would take time to heal. Every part of her had been put through a test, not just of her innocence, but of her very spirit. She had faced an unjust system and come out on the other side, but the cost was high. Yet, through it all, she had learned something invaluable: the power of standing up for herself and the strength that lay in confronting a broken system. She had walked into that courtroom, unsure of whether she would ever walk out again as a free woman. And now, as the days passed, she realized that the fight had changed her. It wasn't just the law she had to face. It was herself, her own strength, and her own voice that had ultimately brought her the victory she now held in her hands. But there was one thing Imani hadn't anticipated: the impact of her lawyer, Olivia. The woman who had stood by her side, unwavering in the face of a system that seemed designed to fail her, had become more than just a legal representative. She had become a mentor, a protector, and, in a way, a symbol of hope. Olivia had done more than just present the evidence. She had given Imani something far more important: the belief that justice could still exist, that good could still rise above evil, and that the truth could set people free if they were brave enough to fight for it. Imani sat in her apartment one evening, her thoughts swirling, when she received an unexpected message. It was from Olivia. "Imani, I've been thinking about what you said after the trial. You mentioned wanting to help others who faced injustice, people who felt powerless the way you once did. I think you make a great advocate. If you're open to it, I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you. Let me know when you're free." The message felt like an invitation to something more, a way for Imani to turn the pain of her past into a force for good. It was a chance to take the lessons she had learned and apply them in a meaningful way. Her hands trembled as she typed her response. She didn't know what the opportunity would entail, but she knew that this was the next step in her journey. And this time, she wasn't going to let fear or doubt hold her back. A week later, Imani found herself sitting across from Olivia in a small, cozy cafe, the kind of place that smelled like fresh coffee and croissants. They had met for lunch before, but this meeting had a different air to it, a feeling that something important was about to unfold. Olivia smiled warmly as she took a sip from her coffee, setting it down carefully. "I'm glad you could meet with me today, Imani." Imani nodded, her nerves evident in the way she shifted in her seat. "I've been thinking a lot about your message. I don't know where to start. I'm still processing everything that happened." "I get that," Olivia said. "It's a lot to take in. But here's the thing. What you went through, the fight for your freedom, it's not something that everyone gets a chance to experience. Most people are too afraid to stand up, or they don't know how to. And that's where you come in." Imani raised an eyebrow. "Me? I don't know what I can offer." Olivia leaned in, her voice steady but full of conviction. "You have a voice, Imani. You've lived through something that most people would never understand unless they've been through it themselves. You can be a beacon for those who don't know where to turn, who don't believe anyone will stand with them." Imani soon realized that even in a world where change was on the horizon, there were forces determined to maintain the status quo. One evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing documents for a new campaign, she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but serious, the kind of tone that immediately put Imani on alert. "It's about your case, Imani. There's been a development, and it's not good. I think you need to be prepared for what's coming," the voice said. Imani recognized the voice immediately. It was Olivia. "What's going on, Olivia?" Imani asked, her heart skipping a beat. "There are some powerful people who aren't happy with the work you're doing," Olivia replied. "And it looks like they're trying to discredit you. They've started digging into your past, pulling up old records, and trying to find anything they can to tarnish your reputation." Imani felt a chill run down her spine. She had known that speaking out against a corrupt system would draw attention, but she hadn't anticipated the lengths to which her adversaries would go to silence her. "They can't do this," Imani said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm doing what's right. I can't back down now." "I know," Olivia said firmly, "but we need to be prepared. This isn't just about your story anymore. It's about protecting the movement. Over the next few days, Imani found herself in a whirlwind of activity. She met with lawyers who specialized in public defamation and personal security, trying to shore up her defenses. The threats against her weren't physical, at least not yet, but they were deeply psychological. The campaign to discredit her was more sophisticated than she had anticipated. False rumors were spreading, and fake news stories about her case began to appear on social media, calling into question the legitimacy of her claims. At first, Imani tried to brush it off. She told herself that no one would believe these lies, that the truth was on her side. But as the attacks grew more relentless, she began to question her own resolve. Is this how they'll try to stop me? She wondered aloud to Olivia one evening. Is this the price of standing up for what's right? Olivia's voice was unwavering. Imani, you knew this fight wouldn't be easy. You're shining a light on things that people don't want to be seen. You're challenging a system that has existed for centuries. Of course, they'll try to break you. But that's where you come in. You have to be stronger than their lies. You have to be the truth they can't deny. Imani took a deep breath, absorbing Olivia's words. She knew Olivia was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about the hundreds of thousands of people who had been wronged by the system, whose voices had never been heard. As the pressure mounted, Imani leaned on her team, drawing strength from the people who had supported her from the beginning. Together, they began to strategize, crafting a counter-campaign that would combat the lies and bring the truth to the forefront. They worked around the clock, gathering evidence, speaking with experts, and using every platform at their disposal to spread the message. One key move they made was to hold a press conference where Imani could speak directly to the public, unfiltered. She would address the attacks on her character, present the facts, and reaffirm her commitment to the cause of justice. The day of the press conference, Imani stood in front of a packed room, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The reporters and cameras were focused on her, their eyes trained on every word she would say. But this time, Imani was prepared. She wasn't going to be silenced. She wasn't going to let them twist her story. I stand before you today as a woman who has been wronged. She began, her voice steady but powerful. But I stand before you today, not just as a victim. I stand here as a fighter. The system that tried to destroy me, that tried to tear me down, is the same system that has harmed so many others. And I will not be the last. Imani took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Yes, they've tried to discredit me. Yes, they've spread lies about me. But none of that changes the truth. The truth is that I was wrongfully arrested. The truth is that there are millions of others who are still suffering. And the truth is that I will not rest until justice is served. The room fell silent as Imani's words sank in. There were no interruptions, no attempts to throw her off balance. In that moment, Imani was in control. She was the one telling her story, and no one could take that away from her. The impact of the press conference was immediate. Social media erupted with support for Imani, and public opinion began to shift. The false narratives that had been spread about her began to unravel. The truth had won out, and Imani's credibility remained intact. However, as the tide began to turn in her favor, Imani knew that this was just the beginning. The forces against her were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to bring her down. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to let fear control her now. I've been to hell and back, she thought, as she prepared for the next chapter of her journey. And I'll keep fighting until justice is served. The days that followed Imani's powerful press conference were a blur of media attention, public support, and mounting pressure. The truth was on her side, but Imani knew that the real test was still ahead. It wasn't enough to sway public opinion. She had to win in the courtroom. She had to stand face to face with the system that had wronged her and show the world that justice could prevail. As the date of the trial loomed closer, Imani's anxiety grew. She had prepared for everything, from the media circus to the relentless pressure, but nothing could fully prepare her for the high-stakes showdown that was about to unfold. The courtroom would be her battlefield, and the stakes could not have been higher. Imani walked into the courthouse on the morning of the trial, flanked by her legal team and a small group of supporters. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She had always believed in the power of truth, but now As the doors to the courtroom swung open, she realized just how much was riding on her ability to hold her ground. Her lawyer, the one who had fought beside her from the very beginning, met her with a reassuring smile. "We've got this, Imani," he said quietly. "The evidence is solid, and you're stronger than you think. Just remember, you're not alone." Imani nodded, drawing strength from his words. She had come this far, and she couldn't back down now. The people who believed in her were counting on her, and more importantly, she owed it to herself to fight for justice. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been falsely accused. The trial began, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor, a stern and calculated figure, opened with a sharp attack on Imani's credibility. He attempted to paint her as a woman seeking attention, accusing her of exaggerating the circumstances of her arrest to further her own agenda. The crowd in the courtroom watched intently, waiting for Imani to respond. But Imani remained calm, her eyes locked on the prosecutor. She refused to let his words shake her. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stood tall, walking toward the witness stand with quiet determination. She knew this was the moment that would define everything. "My name is Imani," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I am here today because the system failed me. I was arrested without cause, treated like a criminal for something I did not do. But I am not here to play the victim. I am here because I believe in justice. I believe that the truth can't be hidden, no matter how hard some people try to bury it." The room fell silent. Every word she spoke seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories, the pain of countless others who had been wronged by the same system. Imani continued, recounting the events of her arrest with raw honesty, each detail revealing the injustice she had endured. She spoke of the fear, the humiliation, the way she had been stripped of her dignity, but she also spoke of the strength that had carried her through. She refused to be a victim, and with each word, she demonstrated the power of her resilience. As Imani finished her testimony, the prosecutor stood, his face a mask of frustration. He had hoped to break her, to find a crack in her story that he could exploit, but Imani had stood firm. She had become the embodiment of the very justice she sought. But the real twist was still to come. Imani's lawyer, a seasoned legal veteran who had fought many battles in court, stood up next. He had been watching the proceedings closely, his eyes sharp and calculating. It was time for his moment to shine. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "you've heard the prosecution's attempt to undermine my client's character. You've heard them try to paint her as a woman seeking attention. But I'm here to tell you that what you've heard is not the truth." Imani's lawyer turned to the jury, his gaze piercing. "You see, the truth is often uncomfortable. It's not always easy to face, and it's not always convenient. But the truth is what will set us free. And the truth is this: Imani was not arrested because of any wrongdoing on her part. She was arrested because of systemic bias and injustice that has plagued this country for far too long." With that, the lawyer dropped a bombshell. He presented a series of documents, official records, witness statements, and video footage that proved the police officers involved in Imani's arrest had fabricated evidence to justify their actions. It was a stunning revelation. The very people who were supposed to protect and serve had tried to cover up their wrongdoings. The courtroom erupted in disbelief. The prosecutor's face turned ashen as the evidence unfolded before him. There was no denying it. Imani had been wrongfully arrested, and the system had tried to sweep it under the rug. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the truth was on Imani's side. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they finally returned with their verdict, it was unanimous. Imani was not guilty. The charges against her were dropped, and the police officers involved in her arrest were placed under investigation. The courtroom erupted in applause. Imani, overwhelmed with emotion, fought back tears as she embraced her lawyer and her supporters. This victory wasn't just hers. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, for everyone who had ever felt powerless against a corrupt system. As she left the courtroom, Imani looked out at the crowd of supporters waiting outside. They had been with her every step of the way, and together They had proven that the truth could not be silenced. The day the verdict was announced, Imani felt a sense of relief like she had never experienced before. It was the kind of relief that only comes when you've fought for something bigger than yourself, when the weight of injustice is finally lifted from your shoulders. But while the courtroom battle was over, the war for true justice was far from won. Imani's victory wasn't just about her personal freedom. It symbolized something much greater. It sent a powerful message to everyone who had ever felt silenced, ignored, or discarded by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Her story became a beacon of hope for countless individuals who had been unfairly targeted, and her victory became a call to action for those who believed that the system could be changed. The media coverage of the trial didn't stop with the verdict. News outlets across the country began to pick up the story, highlighting not just Imani's wrongful arrest, but the flaws within the justice system itself. Journalists interviewed experts, activists, and legal scholars, sparking a nationwide conversation about police misconduct, racial bias, and the urgent need for reform. For Imani, the attention was both overwhelming and empowering. She found herself in the midst of interviews, speaking engagements, and community rallies, all driven by a single purpose: to use her experience to inspire change. The media had painted her as a victim, but Imani refused to be defined by her circumstances. She wasn't just a woman who had been wronged. She was a survivor, a warrior who had overcome the odds and emerged stronger than ever. But despite the public praise and support, Imani knew that the road ahead was still difficult. The victory in court had been one step toward justice, but it was only the beginning. There were still countless others who faced the same struggle she had endured, and the fight for systemic change was far from over. Imani took on a new role, that of an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. She worked alongside organizations that focused on criminal justice reform, using her platform to push for policy changes that would address the root causes of police misconduct and racial inequality. It wasn't enough to simply highlight the flaws of the system. She wanted to be part of the solution. She wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. One of the most profound moments of Imani's post-trial journey came when she met with a group of young women who had experienced similar injustices. They looked up to her, seeing her as a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed stacked against them. Imani listened to their stories, their pain, and their fears, and in return, she shared her own journey, her own fight for justice. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," Imani told them, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "But now I realize that this platform isn't just for me. It's for all of us who've been silenced. It's for everyone who's had their voices drowned out by a system that's supposed to protect them." As she spoke, Imani saw the spark of hope in the eyes of those young women. She realized that her battle was no longer just her own. It was a collective fight, one that would require the strength and courage of many. In the months that followed, Imani's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in roundtable discussions with lawmakers, and even contribute to documentaries about racial injustice and police reform. The once quiet woman who had been falsely arrested was now a force to be reckoned with, a fearless advocate for those who had been left behind by the system. But even with all the accolades, awards, and recognition, Imani remained grounded. She never forgot the reason she had started this journey in the first place: the desire to make sure that no one else had to face what she had faced. Her fight wasn't just for personal vindication. It was for a future where justice truly meant justice for all, regardless of their race, gender, or background. "I've seen the worst that people can do to each other," Imani said in a recent interview, her voice unwavering. "But I've also seen the best. I've seen what happens when people come together to fight for what's right. And that gives me hope." As Imani continued to use her voice to fight for systemic change, her story inspired others to take action. More people began to speak out about their own experiences with police misconduct and racial discrimination. Protests, petitions, and grassroots movements grew in strength, all driven by a shared desire for justice. Imani had become more than a symbol. She had become a catalyst for change. The fight for justice was no longer just a legal battle. It was a social movement, one that transcended courtrooms and made its way into the streets, into communities, and into the hearts of people everywhere. Imani's journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but in the end, it was a journey of triumph. Her victory in the courtroom had been the first step toward changing the system, and though there was still much work to be done, she knew that every step she took, every voice she raised, brought them closer to a world where justice was truly for all. As Imani looked back on everything she had accomplished, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had fought for her own freedom, but in doing so, she had also fought for the freedom of others. Her lawyer had walked into the courtroom and stunned everyone, but it was Imani's courage, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to the truth that had truly stunned the world. Her story was no longer just hers. It was a story of hope, of change, and of the power of one voice to make a difference.